lovely people are all going to talk to the topic, and then it's a dialogue, a conversation with you until a little bit before 5:30. So, I'm going to, I don't need to introduce Rebecca Ann or Kate, but I do need to tell you who Tung is. Tung Luong, is that right?
Yep.
Is that pretty good?
Yep.
Is a Sydney-based writer and lawyer. Tung was born in 1971, the year of the pig, during the Vietnam War. He's been inspired by the role of pigs in fairy tales. His short story, Refugee Wolf, Flying Pig Media, 2013, is a dark, satirical reinvention of the Three Little Pigs. Refugee Wolf is about a society of excess and how it fears asylum seekers. Tung has completed a Masters of Arts in Creative Writing at UTS. What's UTS?
University of Technology, Sydney.
Oh, University of Technology, Sydney. And is currently working on a novel inspired by his late dad, a persecuted journalist during the war. So please welcome Tung. I'd also like to introduce Jenny Cargill-Strong. Jenny Cargill-Strong, on the end here, is a professional storyteller based in the Byron Shire with 5 award-winning recordings of ancestral and original stories, with an enormous passion for healing stories and stories of the feminine. She has performed throughout Australia and New Zealand and has been featured on US Story Radio and ABC Radio National. Now hang on, Jenny, you came first in...
Oh, that was since I wrote that.
Yeah, well, we better put it in. Jenny won first prize in the ABC Story Slam. Now hear this.
In Brisbane, not national.
Jenny is a voluntary ethics teacher, qualified secondary English and drama teacher, and moonlights as a tutor and guest lecturer at Southern Cross University, working within the storytelling unit for the School of Education. She's also co-editor of the Healing the Earth page of the International Healing Story Alliance, a member of the New South Wales Storytelling Guild, and leads the Byron Circle of Tellers. Okay, so just to remind you, well, I'm not actually going to introduce everybody because I'm going to introduce the statement to which this panel will be speaking. Cultural editing. How some fairy tales become lost in the woods. And just before we start, I'm going to encourage the speakers, and I know that we don't need any encouragement, to be as iconoclastic and as oppositional as possible. I know it needs no encouragement. So I'd just like to start perhaps with Jenny. If you could just say what you think the statement is about. Cultural editing, how some fairy tales get lost in the woods. Could you speak to that briefly, Jenny?
I can. Well, the thing that's leaping to mind partly is Red Riding Hood, which some people have already spoken about, and the passion that I have felt in the last year of exploring that story. And I've been a professional storyteller for a long time, but I've never wanted to tell the story of Red Riding Hood or actually many of the classical fairy tales, because as a feminist I had issues. And I'm aware that there are many ways of interpreting each story, and so I looked for many different versions, but I still didn't, and I found feminist rewritings, but I still didn't find the one that just spoke to me until I found the original, which has been mentioned. And I've got very bad French, but L'Histoire de Grand-Mère, you might recognise, the original French version, and then I fell in love with that, and I found that through an article, if you haven't read it already, by Terry Windling. It's not very long, it's a few pages long, and you can just Google it, Terry Windling, and it's about the path of needles and the path of pins. And that made me fall in love all over again with, oh my God, I could tell that story. So I've been living with the wolf and Red Riding Hood and Grandma in the dark woods and feeling so empowered by the imagery of that story, because rather than, now I don't mind having male helpers at all, but just that sense of inculcated helplessness that many of the classic fairy tales become so large in Disney and popular culture have kind of reified that feminine passivity and needing to be rescued. What I love especially about that story, what I don't think anyone's mentioned a great deal today, was that in that version, I mean there are many versions, but in the version she talks about in Terry Windling's essay, and which is in Jack Sipes' collection, The Trials and Tribulations of Little Red Riding Hood, instead of having to be rescued, she is a trickster character. She rescues herself, and she says, look, I've got to go for a piss, and he says, well, I'm going to tie some string around your ankle then. And so she goes outside and she ties the string to a plum tree and tricks him. And then she runs for her life, but she's already done a striptease, so she's running naked. And then she comes to the river and she sees 3 laundresses on the other side of the river. And she calls for help, and they throw the sheet, the white sheet, which is so symbolic and such a beautiful image and motif. But also for me, being a great lover of goddess stories, and the very first story I ever told was the great Sumerian myth of the descent to the underworld of the goddess Inanna. And so I was like, oh, there's the 3 crones, there's the 3 goddesses, the triple face of the goddess, and they help her across the deep, dangerous river. But when the wolf comes, or the werewolf comes and asks for help, they say yes, yes, and they toss across the sheet and they pull him into the middle of the river and they let him go where he drowns. And so I'm working on my version of that story. And as an oral storyteller, I do write my versions down, but I also buff my stories by telling them. So I tell them to an audience. And I was really wanting to tell it this weekend at the conference, and I was really wanting to tell it today also, but it's still shifting and changing in me. And I was feeling, a bit, gotta just get it out. But then I remembered that a very amazing master storyteller in America said that he tells a story for a year before he will tell it professionally. He'll tell it in circumstances and just, it's just living in me. And every time I tell it, something new appears to me, and I'm really enjoying that process. But for me, I've just been in the dark woods with Grandma and the werewolf and just enjoying it so much.
Oh gosh, where to start? I'm also fascinated by rediscovering a lot of the earlier tales, which were incredibly, if you look at it, feminist. Of course, feminism didn't exist then, but they had that spirit to them, like the French tales that you're familiar with. There were heroines called Finette, which meant cunning and clever and smart, and they really were. There's a story by Le Héritier where the heroine actually threatens him with an axe. I'm going to chop you with an axe if you come through this door. And she tricks him throughout the whole thing, and she's brilliant. And I think one of the things I notice when I'm teaching and talking about fairy tales is how few of those tales were known to the audience, how few people actually know about these earlier ones. And yet there's this rewriting that curiously is reproducing these earlier tales without actually knowing about them. Right. So I think there is an earlier spirit there that we're reconnecting with, which is the clever heroine who went missing for a little while, became a bit passive.
Just a bit.
Although having said that, I also like Disney.
That's why after jumping, I was going to go along the line, and I thought, I learned a lot about this woman in her 20-minute lecture.
I don't think Disney merchandising, don't get me started, it's awful sometimes, but the Disney storytelling actually does have a lot of very strong heroines. It's got flaws, it's got problems, but I actually don't think they're doing as badly as people say. Has anyone seen Lilo and Stitch, for instance?
I've seen more.
Yeah.
I've got children.
Of course you have. But I think some of those actually have really positive messages as well, and have very vibrant, talkative heroines. I mean, it was fun when I was teaching The Little Mermaid, one of my tutors, and I had a big argument on who was the worst was at Anderson or Disney, and we played this out for the students because I went, no, Anderson, because at least in Disney, for all its faults, she got to talk, and it was about her getting her voice back, rather than simply allowing herself to dissolve. She actually got her voice back and got what she wanted. Yeah, it was in terms of negotiation with her father, and I think Disney still has a way to go, but I think they're working towards it.
Yeah.
And that's what I kind of want to celebrate.
I guess I was thinking of Disney when I was a child, which is a very different thing. Yeah.
Well, even your aura, Philip's kind of funny. I kind of like him. And the fairies, I mean, when you look at Sleeping Beauty, he doesn't do anything. The fairies are turning stones into flowers. They're incredible. And so I think there's some strong females in those early ones too.
And Disney kept them alive as well.
And there's got to be something said for that.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're all bad. Not all good, but not all bad.
Yeah. Agreed.
So, cultural editing, how some fairy tales got lost in the woods. Kate, would you like to bounce off what you've been listening to and say, talk to that statement?
Well, I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about what I first thought of when I was given this topic, and that is, I obviously have a great love for the Grimm fairy tales, and I've written a whole novel, The Wild Girl, about the Grimm brothers and their female sources of the tale, particularly Dortchen-Wild, who is the heroine of that tale. I obviously have a great love of the French tradition and the Italian, so I celebrate those in bitter greens. But I wouldn't mind having a chance to talk about some other tales that come from my own personal cultural background. On my mother's side, my family was Scottish, and I grew up on Scottish fairy tales, and I just adore them, and they are largely forgotten now, and they're amazing stories of giants and selkies and loch serpents, and the whole Scottish folklore is incredibly rich and incredibly dark and beautiful. And I've drawn upon this in a lot of my books. I have a whole series which is called The Witches of Ilianan, a fantasy series that draws upon Scottish history and Scottish folklore. And then I have a children's book called The Puzzle Ring, which is a time slip adventure about modern day children who go back in time to the days of Mary, Queen of Scots. But the story is deeply rooted in Scottish folklore and Scottish fairy tales, and they actually, at one point, they not only go back in time, but they slip sideways into the fairy underworld of the Sidhe, the fairy folk of Scotland. I've just done a picture book. I haven't got any to show. This is just a cover. Camera one. It's called Two Selkie Stories from Scotland, and it retells, one is quite well known, the Selkie Bride, but the other one, which is called the Seal Hunter, is not well known at all. And these are a pure retelling, and it's just a way of, for me, to celebrate Scottish fairy tales, and I hope to bring them to a wider audience that are not aware of just how rich and beautiful they are. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Romany tales. On my father's side, we have Romany blood, Gypsy blood, and again, the Romany fairy tale tradition is incredibly rich, incredibly beautiful, incredibly wild and irreverent, many of them. And so, as an oral storyteller, I often tell tales drawn from the Romany tradition. And again, I have this feeling that they're unknown, they've been lost, and I'm actually working on one now, which I'm hoping will be published later this year, which is a retelling of how humans first got the first violin. It's a really beautiful tale, and it's a gypsy tale. So for me personally, I obviously have a series of books called The Chain of Charms, or the first in that series is called The Gypsy Crown, and this is the story of two Romany children in the time of the English Civil War, and that book is very rich in gypsy folklore and fairy tales. I retell in the course of those 6 books maybe a dozen different, gypsy tales. And so, for me, I find it quite important that I am aware of and acknowledge my own family's cultural background, and I feel a responsibility to do as much as I can to keep those beautiful old tales alive and to pass them on to a new generation, so that they don't think that all fairy tales come from Grimm's and Disney and other small male tellers.
One of the things, a couple of things that Sarah was saying during her presentation that I was thinking about, my paraphrasing is that meaning is slippery, and things mean different things to us at different times in our lives and in different contexts, and just to us, all of these, the three have just spoken, all I think is this kind of gesture, the personalisation of our relationship to the stories and the symbolism, and it's all valid, I think. There is no one meaning, no one interpretation, but it's such fun mucking around with it and talking it through. So this is a perfect segue to Tom, I think, from you, Kate. It's worked beautifully.
Yeah, I think I've really absorbed a lot of the great comments of today about family and tradition, and just going back to what Sarah Gibson was saying about trying to reconcile meaning, whether you might or you might not, but then later it kind of hits you. And my father was a political activist in Vietnam, and he was in prison. And we came as refugees after the war. And when I was doing my writing course, I'm writing a book about him. And during the course of that, I started to realise his story was historical, but when I thought, well, what about in the Australian consciousness? How can I do something to contribute there? And I was reading The Three Little Pigs to my daughter one night, and our lecturer had said at the time, do something different. And so I basically reinvented that story, really not really understanding it at that time, 3 years ago when I drafted it. And it's a story about, when society gets together, three heads are better than one. They outsmart the wolf. And I didn't know that as a kid. And as I think about what Jenny was saying about masculine power, the wolf, I thought, well, in the context of refugees, what if I turn a wolf into a refugee, but at the same time make him a larrikin, make him from the dominant part of society, don't make him someone who we know or conceive someone on the margins. And so I've got this little short story, it's about 6,000 words, and it's speculative, it's science fiction, it's set in 2500 AD, and it looks at the same structure of the Three Little Pigs. The wolf goes to the planet of straw, the planet of sticks, and the planet of space mansions. But the wolf doesn't know why he's being rejected. You're there as the reader to interpret all the symbols that are in the story. And it's a very dystopian universe that I've created. It's one where it's a society of excess. It's a society that's me. It's a society that's broken. And in this kind of context, in this exaggerated world, when we were talking about Baroque earlier, you're forced as a reader to think, well, in this kind of this world of selfishness, of us just thinking insularly amongst ourselves, we're incapable of thinking of anyone else. And I really have only come to that consciousness only in the last 6 months, just liaising with Belinda, and she's gave me a lot of great references, and so this is a fantastic journey. I'm loving today.
We're all loving today. So, back to the statement, I keep rereading and thinking about it. Cultural editing, how some fairy tales get lost in the woods. Some fairy tales. Have some fairy tales got lost in the woods? Which ones? And why?
I wouldn't mind going back to the French fairy tale tellers. That's and I'm obviously very, very interested in, and I did a lot of research on and work on when I was writing Bitter Greens. And I love the story of Finette. That's one of my absolute favourites. And the lives of the French fairy tale producers, the female fairy tale tellers, was so extraordinary. You know, the Héritière, is that how you say it? I've often heard it. Yeah.
Say it again, Margaret.
The Héritière. I think that's wrong, but you know, her life was extraordinary, and Marie de Catherine, you know, de Olmo, her story is absolutely fascinating as well. And they were proto-feminists. They had private secret societies where they would get together and they would imagine a world where women were not treated like cattle, where it was not, if you murdered your husband, you would not be burnt to death for petty treason, which is what they faced at that time. Their fairy tales were always a coded way of talking about church and state and about male and feminine power. And many of their stories that, you know, the White Cat is another story that I think should be much more widely known.
Rip off my tail and throw it into the fire. Rip off my head and throw it into the fire. You're not leaving the room until throw it. It's pretty full on.
Many of her stories are, and the Green Serpent is another favourite of mine.
Because it actually has an ugly heroine as well.
Yeah, that's why I love
Which
it.
is wonderful.
Can
and
I
she
suggest you put those references on the website?
Yeah. Well, there's also one, The Little Mouse, where at the end she becomes queen. They vanquish the evil king and his son, and the princess becomes queen. And then the fairy godmother goes, okay, we're going to marry you. I'll go around the world and try and find a prince who's good enough for you. And it actually says she has to go all the way around the world to find someone good enough for the princess, which I kind of like that flipping of the norm. And that was so typical of what they were doing. They were rebels.
Do you think that some stories like Beauty and the Beast, Donkey Skin, do you think they've lost they've lost meaning somehow through cultural editing?
I don't think Donkey Skin has lost any of its meaning. I think we're still very clear on what that one means.
We're talking incest.
Yeah.
Incest tale.
Yeah,
But we don't tell it.
Although in France they do.
Yeah, and it's retold often. I mean, it's actually at the heart of The Wild Girl, but in the German version, all kinds of fur. But Robin McKinley has done a wonderful reversion called Deerskin, which is told as a fantasy tale, but it's a very powerful retelling of that particular tale. And we see that in art, you know, and poetry. It's used often
And
by contemporary artists.
there's also a fantastic French film from the 70s that if you get a chance, it will disturb you for life. Their fairy godmother actually does a song where she says, no, you shouldn't marry your father. It's not right.
So let's open it up to the floor a bit. Any questions for the draft here? No, it's just a draft. Okay, where to start? Who haven't we heard from for a while? Oh, we're all good questions here. Alex?
I was just going to say there's a version of Donkey Skin called Scraggle Tag on the Dunes and the story for the years.
Scraggle Tag.
Scraggle Tag.
Yeah.
I like what you were saying, Kate, about the women in what was it, early Italian French times getting together to support each other in terms of releasing their frustrations about lack of power and being treated like cattle and so on. I could really relate to that. And I kind of, for some stupid reason, I think of the joke, and I think of, because I'm really interested in humour and how humour can raise a taboo topic into consciousness without being slapped around the face too much. And I wonder how humour would have been kind of, maybe the fairy tale of that day was the humour of today, you know? I don't know.
Well, some of them were very funny, weren't they? Particularly
The role of humour.
Yeah.
And the Italian, you know, Staccarola and Basil were both very, very funny. You spoke about them.
I sort of think that's what the fairy tale that today is getting forgotten in a sense, because everyone keeps going, yes, it has to be dark, but they were also really, really funny. So I think sometimes people forget to talk about the humour as well.
And I just want to say one more thing about that, and that is people fairy tales. But what they don't realise is that Wilhelm Grimm often added the violence in because he understood that children would find it funny. And so, just for example, in Rumpelstiltskin, at the end of the Grimm story, the gnomic creature, Rumpelstiltskin, he tears himself in half, and then he disappears. Now, Grimm added that detail in, but he added it in to make it more humorous. And children do find that violence, that kind of comic degree of violence, they find it funny. So, I think that we can sometimes accuse the Grimm brothers of being too grim.
Would anyone like to talk to Jenny's experience of rediscovering a story that you thought, well, had been lost to cultural editing?
Well, before you do, can I just add one point on what you were saying, was that I haven't done much therapeutic storytelling, but it's something I'm interested in. The last CD I made is an attempt to use storytelling in a therapeutic way in classrooms, and I've trialled it and used it in that sense. But I went to a group of therapists who worked with girls who had experienced sexual abuse and often incest. And I started by doing a very dark song, which is based on a Bluebeard myth. And I felt that the metaphors would be really pertinent, but not being very experienced and not a therapist, I didn't understand. They were so full of heavy stories, they couldn't bear it. They physically couldn't bear it, and I could feel it in the room. So I then switched to another story, which was with a metaphor, like in terms of humour. I didn't actually use humour, but I could see why that would be relevant and important when you're dealing with a very heavy topic. So I switched to a story which had a song and was much more lighthearted, and was more about resilience and courage in the face of the north wind, which became a more removed metaphor for any adversity. And they said, yes, that we can use and that we can cope with. But not only can we not use that dark story in a therapeutic setting with our clients, but we can't handle it because we are up to here with dark stories. So it's really interesting to me.
Toby had a question, sorry.
More a comment,
comment?
I think in terms of cultural editing or cultural forgetfulness or just cultural lack of awareness, the New World fairy tales are really, people are very unaware of their existence, and certainly they're being told outside. Well, there is a movement in North America telling oral stories that have been told orally and collectively in North America.
New World stories.
Yeah, so I mean, when most people think of fairy tales, they think of Pavlov and the Grimms, but then you get sort of books of classic tales, and they might be from all across Eurasia, even throw in sort of Aboriginal stories or Native American stories or African stories, whatever. But I've never seen a story which has its roots, its ancestry in Europe, but told in an American setting or an Australian setting. And that's something that interests me a great deal, because I think it's important for us to connect culturally to the lands we live in, while retaining connection to the archetypal roots of the power of the mythological stories. And so, yeah, I mean, there's this whole sort of these library volumes of American stories and Canadian stories that are out there. And some of the most incredible research, like Halpert and Widdowson's Folktales of Newfoundland, which is out of print. It was in print for about 5 years.
You've got to get that list.
It's one of the most amazing works of fairy tale scholarships, ever. And it's out of print after 5 years. Anyway, but please, if you get a chance, go out and look up, Richard Chase and all of these other American traditional stories, because they're so forgotten, they're lost in them.
We've come to wind up, but I really want to hear once more from Dunn. Because we've only heard from you once.
Oh, sure. Yeah, just picking up on the point about comedy before. was talking a month ago to Linda about the fine line, between trying to convey a serious message at the same time, being ironic, and it's a very difficult one. I'm reminded by Doe, in his memoir, he talks about talking to Vietnam vets, and I think in that little story, it was one of those gigs that he didn't want to do because he was frightful that a lot of people in the room who didn't know him, looking at him as a young man, someone with an Asian face, coming to talk about whatever he needed to talk about, and he wanted to run away. Yes, sometimes we feel like running away, but for me, in my little story, I've tried to engage the fairy tale, the violence that we spoke about, using it playfully. And I think you understand always the context. And with the asylum seeker debate, obviously there's not much humour in it. But if we can talk about it through the prism of the three little pigs, and I think it's a way forward. It's as some people said today, it's the start of a conversation.